For most of human history, war was brutal, terrifying, and deadly, but it wasn't very expensive in the way we understand expense today. It cost lives, families, and villages, but it didn't require massive budgets, spreadsheets, or long-term financial planning. Armies were made from people who already existed. Weapons were tools. People already owned. A spear was a farming tool. A sword could be used for work as well as fighting. Armor was passed down through families. War happened when seasons allowed it, and ended when food ran out or winter arrived. Kings and lords didn't need economists to fight wars. They needed loyalty. They needed horses. They needed men willing to show up for a short time, fight, and then return home to their fields. Campaigns were limited by geography, hunger, and exhaustion. You couldn't fight forever, because the people doing the fighting still had to survive. They had crops to harvest and families to feed. If a ruler pushed too hard, the army didn't mutiny. In dramatic fashion, it simply stopped showing up. This created a natural limit. War had boundaries, not because leaders were kind or moral, but because the system itself forced restraint. Power was spread out. Medieval Europe, for example, was a patchwork of small territories, each ruled by local lords with their own obligations and loyalties. Kings depended on nobles, and nobles depended on peasants. Armies were temporary. Once a campaign ended, soldiers went home. There was no such thing as a permanent military machine. Castles were defensive, not tools for expansion. They protected land but didn't project power very far. Even the strongest ruler couldn't easily dominate large areas for long periods. War was hard to sustain, and that made it limited. Then something appeared that quietly changed everything. Gunpowder arrived in Europe slowly. At first, it didn't look impressive. Early cannons were unreliable. Early firearms were slow, inaccurate, and awkward. They smoked, misfired, and took a long time to reload. Many traditional elites laughed at them. Knights in shining armor didn't feel threatened by a noisy tube that barely hit its target. But gunpowder wasn't important because it killed knights faster. That's the simple version of the story, and it misses the real point. Gunpowder mattered because it destroyed cheap war. Cannons changed sieges forever. Stone walls that had protected cities for hundreds of years could suddenly be broken apart. A fortress that once guaranteed safety could be reduced to rubble with enough artillery and time. This forced a complete redesign of defenses. Walls had to be thicker, lower, angled. Fortresses became complex engineering projects instead of simple stone barriers that required specialists, engineers, architects, skilled labor, large amounts of material, and all of that required money. Firearms changed armies too. Training a knight took years, even decades. Training a musketeer took months. Batat didn't make war cheaper. Muskets had to be manufactured. Powder had to be produced, stored, and transported. Ammunition had to be constantly replaced. Supply lines became just as important as bravery. Wars were no longer fought with what soldiers carried on their backs. They were fought with what states could deliver over long distances, again and again, without interruption. War stopped being local. It became logistical. It became industrial. Standing armies replaced feudal levies. Soldiers were no longer farmers who fought occasionally. They became professionals, and professionals needed regular pay. They needed food even when there was no battle. They needed equipment even during peace. Armies didn't disappear when wars ended. They waited. They trained. They consumed resources every single day they existed. Victory no longer depended on courage alone. It depended on endurance, and endurance depended on money. This is the moment when power began to centralize. Local lords could not afford cannons. Small kingdoms could not maintain modern fortifications. Feudal obligations were not enough to support continuous warfare. Only large, centralized states with predictable income could survive in this new environment. Gunpowder didn't just knock down castles, it knocked down decentralization. Once rulers understood that war now required money on a massive scale, they faced a problem they had never faced before. Where would the money come from? Temporary taxes were not enough. Emergency contributions couldn't support permanent armies. So states did something radical. They made taxation normal. constant. Expected, what had once been negotiated became assumed. Subjects didn't just owe loyalty anymore. They owed money, regularly. But even taxes weren't enough. Gunpowder wars were huge. They lasted for years, sometimes decades. They involved cannons, powder, ships, fortresses, uniforms, wages, and supplies. The costs went far beyond what taxes could cover, so governments turned to borrowing. This is where finance truly enters the story of modern power. States began issuing debt not as a desperate measure, but as a strategy. Bonds funded wars. Credit became a weapon. Bankers became as important as generals. A ruler who could borrow could keep fighting long after others were forced to stop. War was no longer limited by manpower. It was limited by credit. This changed everything. Once wars could be financed, they could be extended beyond public tolerance. Costs could be spread across decades. Losses could be delayed. Entire populations could be mobilized financially without ever seeing a battlefield. This is how the modern state was born. Permanent taxation. Standing armies. Public debt. Central authority. None of this was created because philosophers thought it was a good idea. It was created because gunpowder made the old system impossible. But this new system came with a human cost. Peasants paid higher taxes. Workers saw their wages fall behind prices. Savings lost value. Debts didn't disappear when kings died. They were passed down to people who had never voted for the war and had never benefited from it. Still, the system survived, not because it was fair, but because it worked. Gunpowder changed the cost of war, and that changed the relationship between money and power forever. But even this wasn't enough. As wars became permanent, states faced a new challenge. They couldn't pay for war, honestly. Raising taxes too much risked rebellion. Borrowing too much risked default. Cutting military spending meant falling behind rivals who were still investing in firepower. So governments found another solution, a quieter one. This is where inflation enters the story. Inflation is often treated like a modern problem, but it's not new. Ancient rulers debased coins by reducing their silver content. But those actions were obvious and dangerous. People noticed quickly. Trusts collapsed. Markets froze. Soldiers refused pay. Governments fell. Gunpowder changed the situation. When war became permanent, states needed a way to spread its cost, slowly, quietly, and widely. Inflation did exactly that. Instead of taking more money directly through taxes, governments could change the value of money itself. Instead of demanding more today, they could make money worth less tomorrow. The cost didn't disappear. It dissolved. Before gunpowder, inflation was used to survive emergencies. After gunpowder, inflation became a way to manage systems. Gunpowder wars were not short events. Cannons wore out, powder spoiled. Weapons broke. Fortresses required constant maintenance. Armies consumed resources every single day. Taxes couldn't keep up. Debt filled the gap. But debt created another problem. Repayment. Inflation quietly solved that too. When prices rise, the real value of debt falls. Governments learned that modest inflation reduced the burden of past wars without forcing open default. Creditors were paid back, but with money that bought less than before. Most people didn't notice immediately. The backlash was small. The system survived. This is why inflation becomes persistent in gunpowder-era states. Not extreme, not destructive, just enough to ease pressure. Once this logic exists, it spreads. Military spending becomes permanent. Debt rolls forward. Inflation becomes tolerated. Financial systems evolve around managing pressure instead of removing it. Central authority grows stronger, not weaker, because coordination is required to keep everything working. This is the true legacy of the gunpowder world. Not just bigger wars, but financialized war. Violence no longer needed immediate consent. It needed liquidity. Political resistance could be outlasted. Sacrifice could be spread across millions of people instead of concentrated on those who fought. This reshaped society. People who never went to war still paid for it. Savings lost value quietly. Wages struggled to keep up. Entire generations inherited obligations created by conflicts they never chose. The connection between war and daily life weakened not because war mattered less, but because its cost was hidden. This is why modern states feel so durable. Today, war is no longer limited by how many soldiers you can raise. It's limited by budgets. Aircraft carriers, satellites, cyber systems, supply chains. These are financial commitments, as much as military ones. The question is no longer who fights best. It's who can afford to keep fighting. Restraint rarely comes from morality alone. It comes from cost. When cost is delayed, absorbed, or disguised, restraint weakens. This doesn't mean war is inevitable. It means war is structural. It lives inside systems designed to make it survivable. That's why discussions about debt, inflation, and public finance are never just economic. They are about power. They are tools that allow states to project force without collapsing. This legacy didn't begin recently. It began centuries ago, when gunpowder made violence too expensive to manage informally. Gunpowder didn't just change war. It changed what power required to exist. Technology raises the price of control. Finance steps in to bridge the gap. And once that bridge exists, it rarely disappears. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And if you want to understand the present, you have to understand the costs buried in the past. Because money, power, and violence have been linked for a very long time, and they're not separating anytime soon. If this gave you a new way to look at history, stay curious. The answers are there, waiting to be uncovered.